Why Race Matters, Chapter 5, Determinism, Reductionism, Reification, Racism. Explaining human behavior via genetic factors commonly provokes charges of genetic determinism or biodeterminism, and is said to be reductive. Biology is supposedly the wrong place to look for the causes of social phenomena. Mention of biological race differences, in particular, is apt to be called racist. Since much of what follows hinges on a biological approach to social behavior, these charges must be considered. Determinism is the thesis that everything has a cause, or equivalently, that everything can be explained, or again, that every event falls under some natural law. Were God to return the universe to precisely the state it occupied at the Big Bang, determinists hold, all would unfold just as before. Determinism is less restrictive than it might at first appear. A determinist may regard social effects, in particular, as determined by any combination of factors whatever, biological, environmental, familial, as long as there are some factors which determine these effects. Determinism is not inherently biological. Most scientists outside the field of quantum mechanics and reflective non-scientists are determinists. We all presume that there are reasons for everything, including human behavior. Environmentalist accounts of behavior are as deterministic as hereditarian, for they assume, as do hereditarian accounts, that identical initial conditions yield identical results. The difference between environmentalists, social environmentalists, and hereditarians is that environmentalists take the conditions relevant to behavior to be exclusively environmental. Social environmentalists take only social factors to be relevant, while hereditarians include biological factors as well. If being deterministic is a flaw, it mars all accounts of social phenomena. So basically he's saying that environmentalists are also determinists. People who think that, oh, it's just your environment that makes you a certain way. Well, that's still saying the environment determines the outcome. So hereditarians are not the only determinists. There's just a disagreement on what are the determining factors. And to say that genes are not a determining factor, that they don't determine anything except for the color of your skin, when clearly that's not the case, is delusional. An easier target is, quote, biological determinism, the thesis that social phenomena are functions of biological variables only, so that, in particular, race differences depend on biology alone to the exclusion of environment. The boldest form of biological determinism, namely genetic determinism, holds that, given an ensemble of genotypes, only one society can emerge from them, whatever the environment. Biological and genetic determinism are indeed implausible, but they are not implied by the view that genes contribute significantly to race differences. So once again, we're not saying that genes are the only thing that matter. We're just saying that it's part of the equation, and we have to refute those who are saying that it's 0% of the equation, because that's ridiculous. So long as genes interact with environment, social phenomena, including those involving race, depend on both genotypic and environmental variables. No sensible position holds that outcomes flow from genotypes alone. To explain a society, the physical environment in which the genes of its members develop must also be specified, a tenet that might be called bioenvironmental determinism. By way of comparison, the principle that gravity controls all motion near the Earth does not mean the final velocity of a falling rock follows from the law of gravity alone. The rock's final velocity also depends on the height from which it was released, a factor independent of gravity itself. A physical determinist need not be a gravitational determinist. Genetic and biological determinism are thus straw men. Hopefully you know what a straw man fallacy is. If you don't, Google it. Why genetic explanations are disturbing. A puzzling aspect of the race issue is the depth of feeling provoked by genetic explanations. People, quote, obsess about nature versus nurture, unquote, according to Herrnstein and Murray, 1994, a compulsion that they trace to the erroneous equation of genetic with unalterable. This diagnosis is surely superficial. Practical worries about the difficulty of raising black intelligence cannot explain the rage and disdain mere mention of genes can provoke. The diagnosis that talk of genes evokes the guy with the funny mustache does more justice to the emotional tone of the debate, but it does not explain why ordinarily acute individuals, capable, one would think, of seeing that hereditarianism is one thing and the Third Reich another, lose all perspective when genes are mentioned. So basically, if you bring up genetic determinism in any way, shape, or form, many people will say, you're a Newtsie. They can't see that there's some middle ground in between Newtsie and reasonable, rational individual who's observing reality. Not to say that the Newtsies were not reasonable, rational individuals observing reality. I'm just saying this guy has a bit of a bias regarding the Newtsies, since he is a member of the Hebrew community, and he probably believes some false propaganda, anti-German stories. Moving on. The true cause, I suggest, is a felt connection between genes and personal identity. If you're insulting someone's genes, you're basically insulting that person. Or if they perceive something as an insult to their genes, it's a personal insult. Most informed persons in the late 20th century conceive genes as part of a person's essence, what makes him what he is. Flaws due to genes are consequently considered constitutional in a way that phenotypically indistinguishable flaws due to environment are not. Some such thought must be imputed to anyone who calls talk of genetically lower intelligence an insult to blacks, yet insists that blacks do poorly in school because deprivation stunts their mental growth, since the second hypothesis, as much as the first, implies that blacks are less intelligent than whites and is therefore no less negative. It is not simply a case of people ignoring unwelcome implications of their own words. In denouncing genetic explanations while embracing environmental ones, people are responding to a difference between them. The difference is this. If a child, a neonate or fetus, suffers brain damage from an environmental cause like malnutrition or trauma, it makes sense to say that he might have been more intelligent and that he would have been more intelligent under other circumstances. But if his neurological condition was in his genes, then he could not have been more intelligent, even with different genes, since different genes would not have produced him. Genes are of the essence of personal identity, so talk of a genetic black intelligence deficit seems to ascribe a defect to the black essence. Most people are reluctant to draw so harsh-sounding a conclusion, because they're pussies. This fear could be allayed by decoupling genes from identity, but the connection is tenacious. The average person would almost certainly agree that he could have been born with different arms or legs. He would probably agree that, if the very sperm and egg that produced him had met in a different place and time, and the person they produced went on to lead a life wholly unlike the life that he actually led, this person would still have been him. Finally, the average person would probably agree that, had the sperm and egg that actually produced him never fused, but another zygote in his mother's womb had grown into an adult with his appearance and personality, that person would not have been him. Judgments of identity track genotypes. Kripke, 1973, compares the relation of a person to his genes to that between a physical object and its constituent atoms. Once your kitchen table has been destroyed, a table made of different atoms, no matter how similar, cannot be that very table. Judgments of physical identity track atomic constituents. As to why identity works this way, Kripke considers these relations, quote, metaphysically necessary, while empiricists suspect that they are byproducts of linguistic convention. A conventionalist analysis of identity intuitions might draw some of the sting from genetic differences in highly valued traits. But as things stand, the widespread, albeit inarticulate belief that genetic traits, hence genetic flaws, are essential is one more disturbing aspect of race. Reductionism. The question now shifts from the existence of laws connecting individual genotypes to phenotypes, to the possibility of explaining social phenomena via the genetically determined phenotypes of individuals. The case against this reductionist goal rests on the idea that social phenomena are autonomous, explanatorily and ontologically. Thus, Natalie Bluestone says, quote, "All biological explanations of culture suffer from the impossibility of reducing an independently valid domain with valid explanatory principles of its own to what are considered more basic principles. But just as it does not make much sense to explain that the table represented in Cézanne's painting The Card Players is really only a system of electrically charged particles, it does not make sense to assert that women do not paint great pictures for biological reasons." End quote. This claim is immediately suspect, since it seems perfectly sensible to say that, for biological reasons, no fat man has ever won a marathon, an event in the domain of culture, or that, for biological reasons, chickens do not paint great pictures. So far as I am aware, though, the anti-reductionist literature does not respond directly to concrete examples of successful reduction. Rather, it presses two abstract arguments. The first points out, correctly, that social phenomena are specified by rules and norms. What counts as a crime, for instance, is defined by legislative decision. There is no physical characteristic common to all crimes. A hand movement may constitute forgery in one social context, yet a physically similar movement in another context, as that of an actor in a historical drama writing John Hancock, may be legal. Conversely, any hand movement whatever could be wrongful in some context or other. But only physical traits can be programmed genetically, the argument continues, so gene-based and social categorize behavior in disparate ways. This mismatch between social and biological categories prevents biology from explaining social behavior like crime. There can't be a gene for criminal hand movements because genes cannot determine or anticipate external norms. An analogy may clarify this argument. Multiplying is an abstract mathematical operation defined by the rules of arithmetic, not a physical process. You can't learn it by watching what happens inside a computer. Trying to understand society by studying genes, say the anti-reductionists, is like trying to learn to multiply by looking inside a computer. As might be expected, this first argument is too good to be true. In the first place, while in principle, crime does not coincide with any one type of bodily movement, in practice, certain movements are almost always criminalized, and many criminal acts consist of specific movements. The physical act of striking another human being with one's fist is criminalized in every society with a formal legal code and informally sanctioned in all others. Readiness to punish such behavior is apparently found even among non-human primates. Striking another human being is acceptable on occasion, as a boxing match, but a disposition to throw punches eventually violates the norms of any group. And since genes can program behaviors like punching, there can be genetic explanations of crime consisting of such behavior. Thus, while it may make no sense to speak of a crime gene, or to call blacks genetically more crime-prone than whites, it does make sense to say that blacks are genetically more prone to behavior that is, in fact, criminalized in virtually all societies. In the second place, the genes of more developed organisms program learning, as well as specific behavior. A pitcher plant's genes simply tell it to secrete digestive fluids when its cilia are touched, but a squirrel is told to return to where it has previously found acorns. Human genes set even more sophisticated learning tasks, such as determining what skills impress local females. Since human genes can program learning, there is nothing to keep them from programming an impulse to identify and refrain from locally forbidden behaviors. And if there can be innate impulses to identify and follow rules, there can be biological explanations of individual and group differences in the strength of those impulses. It therefore becomes meaningful to conjecture that an innate tendency to follow certain rules, or rules in general, is stronger in one group than another. This offers a precedent for reducing race differences in social behavior to genetic differences. The second major anti-reductionist argument runs that social facts concern relations between individuals that transcend their individual traits, and since genes program only individual traits, they cannot explain social facts. A standard example: the behavior of a mob emerges from the interaction of its members and cannot be predicted from the traits of those individuals alone. Indeed, the argument goes, social roles shape their occupants. People are the way they are because of their places in society, not vice versa, leaving the heritability of phenotypes doubly irrelevant to social behavior. Although this argument does not appear especially relevant to race, its application turns out to be quite far-reaching. Once again, the factual basis of the argument is incontestable. Collective behavior does transcend and constrain individuals. An isolated Robinson Crusoe cannot vote, or be rude. And a normally well-behaved man caught up in a riot may smash a window because of his proximity to other rioters. Moreover, social groups, like mobs, have lives of their own, persisting despite the loss of individual members. Yet, while a mob's existence is independent of any one of its members, it is not independent of all of them. Once all the rioters disperse, the mob perishes. In contrast, the existence of an individual does not depend on any of the groups he belongs to, or all of them together. A mob's members survive its dissolution, and all men could live, albeit unhappily, as isolated Robinson Crusoes. So social phenomena depend ontologically on individuals in a way that individuals do not depend on social phenomena. Furthermore, because the traits of a group depend on the character of the individuals composing it, not just any individuals can generate just any social fact. No matter how many penguins congregate on an ice floe, or for how long, they will never form a constitutional monarchy. It therefore makes perfect sense to seek to explain a group phenomenon via the characteristics of the group's constituent individuals, and equally good sense to suppose that some of those characteristics are genetically influenced. There can therefore be two-step genetic explanations of group phenomena, from genes to individual traits, and then from individual traits to group traits. This is the structure of genetic explanations of cultures and cross-cultural differences, in particular differences between cultures composed of different races.